versus sand.
I was gonna say, the rock there is where the words, so you're
So what we really mean
I would like
is
it.
the foundation of your faith about him or about Satan or about church or something. So, I don't know why it took me so long to figure that out, but that's so given your sessions, your series, these classes here, I don't know, I'm wondering
saying
what
I'm preaching Sunday night.
more of the theme. Yeah, so I'm not Sunday night, it's the next thing.
Yeah, well, the Sunday, it titles, how can the church gain a good name? But what it's really about is the churches have reputations. I'm talking about what this church is.
Local
reputation.
churches.
I'm talking about what I think this church is reputation. When we come back to the name out front and break it down again, what it ought to mean to each one of us, then I'm gonna go back and talk about the character. Some of those passages that kind of describe everybody's good, like all of you, humility, and since I've used that chart each lesson about the purpose, inward, outward, upward purpose. I'm going to go through each one of those and explain why. You don't have that character, that devotion to Christ personally. You're harming the body. You've hurt, damaged that inward peace.
Or
Here's how.
and you disable the mission to some extent.
Exactly. And so the outward, you reflect a poor name. You help create a name, a reputation that brings harm to what otherwise would have been God intended for this church to be able to do, accomplish, build up. So that's that lesson. And then the ones in the future are going to be more about the actual purpose, trying to take each one and find and spend some time.
You mean the upward, outward type?
The closest to what you're talking about, you didn't really get into. The last lesson, I talked about how to Christ lead the church, and it was establishing that he does the work. But I didn't go into a lot of detail on what he actually said. What does that mean? It's kind of like establishing that is the rock, his word. That's how he's gotten me.
So what are the foundation? What I think what your whole series is, what I think the theme is, which is what are our foundational beliefs and why we hold about topic A, topic B, topic C. One of which happens to be the church. One is sanctification, one is family. So that was the latter part of the.
Marty, you've been in the sun.
Running some outside, but yesterday left early and just walked around the track for about an hour and a half. And then I watched the Peachtree,
Road
or
Road.
the Dunwoody 4th of July parade this
Right,
morning for a couple
outside.
hours. Oh,
What channel was it on?
This was outside, in the sun.
Oh, I was sort of say you're tan. is what I was
Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah, the best spot to see the parade, this is unbelievable, was out standing in the sun, not under trees.
Yeah, well, that's the way it usually works. How
It
long
was
was
nice,
it?
a nice parade.
We went hiking today, but before we did, we were trying to pick it out. Talked about the memorable hike that 2 year boys and I and Matt had where we didn't have enough water. We
Oh, I was
down
with you.
ball and that
Yeah, I
really
was with you.
long,
Yeah, got up there, nothing was.
Nothing's
no,
open.
No fountain.
Water fountains are closed.
But it was downhill the rest of the way.
Because I remember the downhill was like this, and you had blisters, and you were having to go.
Yeah.
It was awful.
Well, you remember we started way away from the mountain, so
Oh,
we
it's
could
like
get
a-
more of an elevation.
It's like a 12-mile round trip. All right, I'm sure y'all are pondering these questions deeply,
What are the questions?
thoughtfully. The first one we'll come back to, Chester. I'll just give you one that are pretty long. The first one is, what are some activities of this church specifically intended to strengthen our relationships with each other? In other words, things perhaps we've planned out and we do and are meant at the end to have brought us closer together. Help us accomplish the inward purpose we talked about last time.
Preaching the word?
Yeah, don't answer them right now. This is the thinking of them on your own. So Chili Ang and Jennifer Carr has broken down and they will not make it tonight.
Uh-oh.
It's really nice of them letting you know.
Yep.
I don't know. Let's see.
Could just be like, couldn't do this right.
Well, I know, that's the thing.
Or it could be like
yeah,
side
like,
285.
We're on the side of 285, please send help. Exactly. Shoot the flares.
Steve?
We'll send Barry.
I saw Philip out changing a flat tire at the beginning, so maybe he's already in the, he's in the mode.
285, you probably hear
Oh,
on the unit. What's it called?
Unless it's
Is
a
it
Saturday
5
night. What was the wait time y'all were talking about?
It was a couple hours, I think, and so was AAA.
Yeah, that's why you call AAA all the time.
That is the best thing ever.
I've had one for 10, 15.
But that night, their wait time was 2 hours too.
Really? Everybody was broke down.
Yes. Okay, I have copies of tonight's lesson in case you don't have your notebook. I actually have one more notebook here if you've never gotten one. And if you don't have your notebook, I've got Appendix A, which shows all the deacon duties, and I would like us to talk about some of those at some point in the class. So I will give you that. It is tonight. And if you do have your notebook, Appendix A will have it. It should be in the back. You got the appendix of that. Anybody else could use tonight's lesson or the appendix? You okay? You got what you need?
I left mine at the house, been at my mom's. I read it. Do I need it for tonight?
You might not, but you'll need appendix A for sure.
Thank you.
Should be in the back. Wait just a minute and catch a couple other folks as they're coming in. Make sure y'all have this. Tonight's lesson. I want you to have also. Yes, it's in the notes. We'll come back and talk about appendix A a little later on, but this is the actual lesson. All right, let's get going. You got these questions, so just be thinking about that. We're not going to cover those quite yet. We'll come back to those as we get a little bit deeper into the class. So here's our title. And remember, we're really trying to think not only just about a lot of different ways we could think of this title, but one thing we haven't said as much about is, I hope as we go through this, we're also examining and being very self-reflective about what this church here is doing. And as we look through a lot of these passages and think about it, is it matching up? And are we gaining maybe a better view, a vision of what this church here ought to be? Because I hope at the end, it really helps to change all of us in terms of our personal service.
What's the title?
You know what the title of the class is?
Oh, I thought you saw the title of this class,
Yeah, no,
this segment.
No, I'm coming up on that. So here's the actual title of this class. Get this cool setting off of 84 degrees down to something like that.
It's not on heat, is it?
No, it says cool, but it's still not gonna work this at 84. All right, so we're in the second half of the class. We're down to the purpose of the church. We covered lesson 8. And you notice that the 3 lessons, 8, 9, and 10, we're trying to think about what God's intention was for the church in terms of what we do for each other. How are we accountable to one another within any local body of God's people? I put some titles to that. We've already talked about lesson 8, building up one another. Tonight we're going to talk about relationships. And I think you'll quickly see, especially if you were here, able to be here on Sunday morning, the connection between our ability to build up one another and the need to really have strong and deep relationships. I'm not sure how we could even think about how we could do the things we talked about in Lesson 8 unless we're actually building the right kinds of with one another here. All right, so we have some other things coming up after this, the other purposes of the church. Well, let's just jump right into it. So here are our goals. And we've kind of begun to shift away from the first two goals. They're important. And the goals of the class are meant to be what would be the personal change within us. If I finish all 13 lessons, I've thought these things through, what would be different about me at the end? Am I submitting my life more fully to the kingship of Christ? Having a more accurate view. Have I learned some things and giving me a clearer view of what God really intends for the church to be or not be? But we've highlighted 3 and 4 because these lessons, as we begin to think about purpose, are really important for us to think about our own individual relationship to one another here. So, for example, am I more determined to please God? I think what we decide to do as a church and what we decide to do as individuals is much more driven by this focus on what does God want versus me, and maybe we sometimes give attention to. It helps us make a lot of decisions where perhaps God has even given us some latitude, but when we really want to please God, sometimes we find ourselves restricted to some things that we know for sure will please Him instead of taking some chances on that. But the last one, be a more active, faithful member of the church. And you see there's 3 activities there in our efforts to stir up one another, telling others of Christ, honoring God, and worship. Those match with the 3 purposes that we'll talk about. So, of course, our attention tonight is more about our efforts to stir one another up to good works. Does that make sense? Those are our goals. And all right, so let's go back to Ephesians 4. Open your Bibles to Ephesians 4, 11 and 16. I passed it out on Sunday morning. We had one translation that we were all using. It's okay to use some different ones here, but what I want you to do real quickly is to look in that passage and find things that show how each one of us is active in doing something or something is happening to us. So we've described Ephesians 4, 11 through 16 as one of the best scriptural pictures of what the church is. Talks about these gifts given to the church, certain leaders and things, but then here's what the church is doing. So if you see something in there that talks about kind of everybody, what we're involved in doing, or what's happening to us, let me know what it is. Let's pull some of that out. Michael, you got one? You're looking up.
Sure. So in verse 12, like it says all these leaders equip the saints for the work of ministry, which seems to imply that the saints then are doing this work of ministry.
Okay, that's good. So they're going to be involved in it in some way. It's not just the leaders are out doing the work. The leaders are equipping others to actually be engaged.
Verse 16, we're all to do our part, but the body is fitly put together.
Yeah, and it's given the imagery of a body working, but a body doesn't work well unless every single part of that body is doing its own function. So in this case, we're talking about the church as a body. The church is not doing well. We wouldn't be doing well here at Embry Hills unless everybody is doing their own individual part. Keep that in mind. Yes, Steve?
That verse 16 ends in love, so we need to have that attitude, because if you go through the motions and do actions,
Okay.
if it's not out of love, then it's not going to carry the weight.
Yeah, so that's maybe less of a passage talking about or showing that we're all doing it, but it gives the idea of how we're doing some of these things you see in this passage. Speaking the truth in love. Yeah.
Maturing.
Maturing.
To the fullness of Christ.
Yeah, and which verse is that? Because I think that's one of the ones that really says it's we or we're all or something. Which one is that?
13.
Yeah, so verse 13, the idea until we all attain to the unity of the faith and knowledge. So it's a focus on every single person is being affected by this. Any more? Yeah, Patrice.
Well, the whole passage talks about kind of the different strengths, abilities, and talents that we might have, that we're all be
Yep.
using them. But we have to use them towards the same effort to get in the, I guess, 16
Mhm.
talks about being knit together I think it's all towards one purpose is all.
Yes, it's not like there's just a lot of activity going on in lots of different directions. It seems to be somehow or another, we are working in a coordinated way together. That something is happening for the entire body. Steve, I'm going to put it up. I got a few highlighted. I didn't want y'all to be distracted by the highlights. I'll show you the verse in a minute, but we'll go to you and then we'll put it up. Didn't you have your hand up?
Yeah, just that we're talking about growing up into Christ,
Okay.
which is similar to maturity, but
And it says we are growing up. So you get the picture. It's the individuals. Each one of us is having this happen. We are growing up into Christ. So here are several. Katie mentioned verse 13, till we all attain. And of course, it's focusing on that maturity. Verse 14 is another one, wasn't mentioned. Each one of us is in a growth pattern. We don't want to be children anymore, kind of tossed to and fro, not really understanding God's will, susceptible to tempting things. It's this idea of being strengthened, built up, stronger in our faith. Grow up in every way, verse 15 says. And then the verse that several of you pointed to, verse 16, kind of everybody pulling together. Each part has got its own responsibility. That's the picture of Ephesians 4. We also looked at Hebrews 10 in that last lesson about this inward purpose, what we are all accountable for doing. And you saw here the idea that we are to consider how to stir up one another. In this passage, we often use to talk about attendance. We try to get off of that thought as much on Sunday morning, put a little more thought to why would we be together? What is supposed to happen when we're all together? And he gives some ideas here, the idea of stirring up one another, encouraging one another. I want to go back to that beginning part of verse 24. It's not just that we are to stir one another up to love, but what did he say before that we're to do?
Hold fast the confession of our hope.
I'm sorry, Ken?
Hold fast the confession of hope is the verse 23.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, not the verse before, but at the beginning part of this
Oh.
verse, and somebody said it back there, I'm sorry.
Consider.
Consider. We actually ought to be thinking about that, shouldn't we? You ever, before you get here on Sunday or tonight, think ahead of time, okay, what can I do in the next hour or two to stir up others around me? And that is what he's saying. Let us consider how to do this. How can I do that? What is going to be the effect of my presence and my involvement with others here? Am I going to be a source of encouragement or discouragement? Am I going to stir them up? Not just because I'm here, and sometimes that does a lot of it by itself. I can think of another number of people that, if they're just here, I know the difficulty it took for them to be here. I'm already stirred up by them just simply showing up. But there's some other things here. So there's thought to be put into how this happens. All right, I want you to turn to Romans 12, and we're going to, you can mark Romans 12. We'll come back to it in several different ways. Here's another great passage that gives a description of what the church ought to be. See, and it might be worth just for a moment saying again that the word church just means a group of people, an assembly of people. And the reason why that's so important is because when you go to Romans 12 and you start to read that, your first thought might not be the idea of, okay, he's talking about a church setting. Because we might have in mind that church is about when you come to the building and you worship God. Or again, the church might be some other institution that's over here that's apart from me. If we understand that we are the church, and then you look at Romans 12 and you begin to see this description of Christians involved with each other, I think you'll agree this is a picture of the church, the way it ought to be functioning here. So in verses 4 through 7, in this section, I want you to notice, first of all, that all we're doing is making the same point that we made out of 1 Corinthians 12. Remember we went to 1 Corinthians 12, and what's the imagery that Paul uses to describe what the church is in 1 Corinthians 12? Remember that?
Body.
It's a physical body. So he's got eyes talking to feet and so forth to try to illustrate the idea of the body. But among the things that he is trying to get across is that when you have a church, like the church there in Corinth, how many bodies are we talking about there? There's really one. He's trying to say, here's one body, but it's made up of many members. And we need to stress the idea that every single member has an important role. I think you could see the same thing. There's a reason why I didn't go to Romans 12 then, because I wanted to kind of hold it off. Because Romans 12 not only makes that point, it's going to make our point tonight about the relationships that we should have. But you see some of the same language that was there in 1 Corinthians 12? As in one body, we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function. There's the same imagery of a physical body. So now he's turning to it. Steve, you're trying to make a point? Or?
I was going to wait till you finish.
Okay. We, though many, are one body in Christ and individually members one of another. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, you're saying one body, and I always think there's a reason for the words that are used in the Bible.
Yep.
Is it taking it too far to say that one implies a singleness of purpose? That, it's implied there, but it could have just said body with members. Then you've got an arm doing one thing, another arm doing something else. They're not really working together, but one body with many members kind of implies everybody's working toward the same goal, which gives it purpose.
I think that's exactly the idea in mind, and I think that fits perfectly with Ephesians 4, verse 16, where he even more clearly says what you just described as far as how a body works and compares it there to the church, the way that should happen. But then you notice in verse 6, he begins to describe the diversity of those members. That was one of the points we made out of 1 Corinthians 12. Not everybody's the same. There are different gifts. And what are some of the gifts that he describes here in Romans 12? I'm sorry. Yes, service, generosity. Do we think about that sometimes as a gift? Some people, would you agree there's some people here who are just more inclined to serve others? It's a more natural part of their being. You almost can't think of that person without thinking of the service that they render to others. And I think about myself, sometimes I have to kind of struggle to get myself in the mood maybe to serve, but there's some, it just seems like that's just a gift, natural gift. What are some others? Other gifts that you, yeah, Katie? Teaching. Is one. Yep. Leaders, the leading here talks about that. That's a gift. Somebody maybe is a little more capable of doing that. What else? Teaching, leading, serving.
Showing mercy.
Yeah. That's interesting. The one who does acts of mercy. Some find it easier to forgive or to extend long suffering to someone. That's an important gift. Are there times when that's very essential within the body? And some are able to be able to make a case for somebody, to show that the need for that mercy, or to put an arm around somebody who's greatly discouraged and show them mercy in the moment. That's a talent and ability that some have more than others. Some other things here. Anything else? We mentioned, one reason I like this one versus 1 Corinthians. So a lot of 1 Corinthians 12 is about miraculous things that people do today. Despite that, it at least makes the point that there's diversity. This one's a little clearer about some things that we think of as relevant today. But even the prophecy there, yes, the prophecy could be talking about the ability through the Spirit to be able to say or know things that you haven't necessarily learned. That would be one of those gifts that they had that I think have been done away with now. But some have pointed out there are other ways to think about the gift of prophecy. Do we sometimes need people who are able to come up to you and say, you just need to stop doing that? You ever had a strong, solid voice in your ear that was actually really helpful? Somebody told you something right at the moment when you needed to hear it? That's another gift that people have. And so a diversity of gifts is what's being stressed here.
I think mercy of speech has also been important in my life, because sometimes we can be together as Christians because we're supposed to judge and discern good from evil, but sometimes it's wonderful to have somebody in that group that says, we really need to not be so hard on that person, or you gotta remember they're a new convert, or you gotta remember what they're going through, and those are the kinds of words that we need to have in our vocabulary more often. And that, I appreciate when others have done that in my presence.
And if you think of what that gift is, it's not just a gift of the language to say it, but maybe it's even a little bit of the gift of the insight to recognize when somebody's being neglected or being pushed in a way that could be harmful to them, and pulling the rest of us back from that, or bringing focus and attention to somebody that needs that element of mercy. What a wonderful gift when somebody has that. You see why it's important, though, within one body of people, for all of us, that there be those here who have different gifts? What if, we were all really good at the prophecy thing, letting you know when set you on the right path? Well, that's great, that's needed, but what if all we had were prophets and no one who spoke with that kind of mercy and awe? We need to be sure that we are using the diversity of the gifts. That's one of these relationships, as we're trying to talk about, are important. And I wanted to also draw your attention to Acts chapter 2, because here's the picture of the church in Jerusalem, right as the church began. This is the same chapter where in verse 38 you have individuals responding, being baptized. Thousands are now being added to the body of Christ. But look at what they were doing here. Let's read it, and then I've got a question for you. So, Jason, do you mind reading this, and then I'll ask the question.
And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts.
Would you agree that this is a close congregation, close body of believers? Everybody agree? Anybody want to debate the question of whether they're close? It's kind of hard to win that debate based on these verses here. What in this passage describes to you the intensity of their relationship? Just how close? If y'all all seem to agree that they are close, what tells you that? What speaks to the intensity? All things in common. Notice that word all. Is that there?
The use of the word all is like all encompassing.
Yes.
And then they're also daily. It's day by day.
Yeah, so you get this idea of like
And all encompassing.
everybody, all the time. That's the day by day part. All who believe were together. They had all things in common. When there was this great need, we're going to come back, by the way, and pull out some of the thoughts about how in their relationship they were addressing the physical needs that were there among them. But in verse 45, it does begin to talk about that. And when they had that great need, what did they do?
Sold the possession.
Sold their possessions and belongings. There's something about putting the two words together. I don't know what it is. I kept reading this for the last several days. They were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing. Just not holding anything back. If it was needed, they were going to put it in and sell it, so that they were distributing the proceeds to all. And who had a need? Does anybody left? This passage doesn't talk about it. There's another one that uses in a negative statement the fact that no one had any need. Oh no! In the middle of verse 45, they did this as any had need. Again, you see the intensity. It's all, any, day by day, selling even their possessions and belongings. So an intense, close relationship in the church there in Acts chapter 2. I like to say that we don't have the same physical needs of the members here to have to do that kind of intense selling and distributing. Although we're going to come back and talk about the need to address those things. Don't get caught up so much in this passage about what they did to address a specific problem there, but do focus on the degree to which they were ready, willing, like that church was in Jerusalem. I like to take us back to Romans 12 and suggest this to you. So if you're in Romans 12, look at verses 9 through 12. Now, in verses 9 through 12, and then it'll become even clearer as we begin to go in verse 13 and further into that discussion there. You're going to find a lot of statements made about how they were working together. And so there's a lot of relationship discussion in Romans 12. But the first thing I want you to pull out, though, even while he's talking about their relationship with him, he keeps coming back, it seems to me, and also talking about what every single person should be like. I would say that's why I put the word personal morality or personal spirituality here. So pull some things out of verses 9 through 12 that you see in Romans 12 that speak to what each person should be like, what describes their character, their spirituality, their personal morality, if you will. What do you got?
First line there, let love be without hypocrisy.
Okay, so these are people that have love, genuine love. What else?
To hate what is evil and cling to what is good.
Right? So that's part of the character. It matters to them. There's an emotional feeling about what's evil. They hate it. Don't want that.
So your devotion goes beyond some afterthought.
Yeah, which verse are you pulling from,
I'm
Steve?
sorry, that's beginning verse 10.
Okay, yes. So read verse 10 because we're going to find that it comes in different. I think that is one of the ones that comes with some different thoughts, depending on your translation. How does your verse 10 read?
The translation says, be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor.
Okay, and we got something besides give preference to one another, outdo one another and show honor. Yeah, there's kind of two thoughts. Either you're trying to put your brothers and sisters first and give preference toward that, or it's about almost as if we're in a competition with each other to see how much more good we can. I'm going to show you. I'm going to do a lot more good for you than you're going to do for me. Obviously, that's an exaggerated thought, but it gets back to the idea of how important it was to them to doing those kinds of things. So here are people involved in good works for each other. Other thoughts about this personal morality. And that, by the way, that's one of those verses that begins to connect to the relationships. But some of these things aren't even talking about relationships. It's just abhor evil, for example. They didn't talk about relationships.
Some of the earlier passages we read, I've talked to people before that have thought, well, different gifts, having gifts, makes it sound like it's something that you're given. And so if I don't really have it or feel uncomfortable, then it's not really my forte, and so I let everybody else do the thing. But when you read this right here, it sounds like it's something everybody should be responsible for. And when you go back to Ephesians 4, and it says building up everybody to completeness, well, then we should be working toward that. We may not be able to do everything,
Yes.
but we should be able to do more.
Yeah, look at verse 11 as maybe a passage that stresses that point, Steve. The idea of do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit. So I'm actually making efforts in these things. And part of that effort is toward becoming and using not only the gifts I have, but developing others so that I'm more capable, more able to do those things. What else do you see? Anything else in verses 9 through 12? I'm going to put a list up here of some of this personal morality. Yeah, Katie.
So like in 12, it just says, you should be joyful in hope and patient and be faithful in prayer. Those are things that they need to be doing.
Yeah.
Individually is individual.
Prayerful people. Again, that's not necessarily talking about relationships. I'm a prayerful person. But I will insist that until you become more and more of the person described in verses 9 through 12, you're not open to the sorts of relationships that are really going to build a church up. And so I have to start with myself and make sure that I abhor what is evil and hold fast to what's good, this fervency in my effort and in spirit, striving to serve the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation was another one we didn't mention, and being constant in prayer. That's a description of me. But if I'm that kind of person, this relationship things we're going to see in this passage are much easier to accomplish.
Just one thing we haven't said this whole time because it's maybe so obvious, but we need to say it, is that we know each other.
Yes.
And we, that's just huge. We have to know one another, we have to know our needs, we have to know our weaknesses, we have to know our strengths. We have to know when your birthday is,
That's
just those kinds of things.
very good. That's exactly where we're headed with the rest of it. So if you begin to look at verses 13 and forward, you'll already see some of this, I think it's not, But if you look at verse 13 and forward, you'll see even more of what Patrice is talking about. Now, you go back to verse 10, which is part of what Steve brought up before. You got love one another with brotherly affection. So this is concerned. That one is clearly a passage about relationships, not just my personal morality, maybe the love part, but I'm connecting to others. But more of some of the things that Patrice was talking about. I'm going to hold the thought on verse 13 because we're going to come back and show several places in Acts where the church actually did this very thing. The idea of being concerned to address the needs of the saints, to show hospitality. But look at this. Look at how well this fits with what Patrice was talking about. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. What are the challenges to being able to do that? Especially in a group of this size, maybe.
You have to know when it's appropriate to rejoice or to weep.
Yeah, you got to know about those things, right? You got to know what's going on in somebody's life. And I want you, as you think about that difficulty sometimes of knowing it, I'll come back to some of the things that I asked you in those thought questions. What's the church doing? What are we doing as a whole and thinking about how to address the ability to do this very thing? The importance of knowing birthdays and occasions. And, should we know when somebody's graduating or getting a promotion or moving on, or when somebody has a family issue, even if it's their mom or dad or a brother in another city somewhere that's a difficulty for them? Those kinds of things are essential to know if we're really going to be able to weep with those who weep or rejoice with those who rejoice. What about the living in harmony with one another? One thing that's so important about that is creating that environment of peace. If we're going to all grow, do you understand why it's so important to be in a place where we get along with each other? When that's not the case, is there really going to be the sort of growth we saw there in Ephesians 4 that's supposed to happen to everybody? It's a great problem. And finally this, associated with the lowly. In verse 16 says, as far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all, so there's that harmony again. One thing I want to really stress about this is, you're here on a Wednesday night, come back to one of the smaller classrooms, side classrooms and all. That's usually a sign that you really intend to be, want to be more engaged in the activities and the practices of this church. But do you feel like that everybody that's a member here has that sense of truly belonging to each other and the kinds of things we've been describing out of Romans 12? Is that true for everybody? Everybody feels like they know their place, what they're supposed to be. And I'm not saying, by the way, that this is necessarily true for everybody here, but it's probably more true for this group. But I think this is important when it's telling us, be sure we're paying attention to everybody, especially associating with the lowly, that nobody's being left out. And to look around and consider that, because we're drawing the ideal picture. It's easy for us to do it. The scriptures paint an ideal picture, but then expect us to do the effort and work to make it true. Part of that is this need to associate with the lowly. Okay, Steve?
Does this have I get a picture sometimes that some people are in a competition to show how much they know. To where they're like, counting angels on the head of the pin, so to speak.
Yes.
When really it's the foundational things, which gone over and over and applied and put in practice is what really makes the difference.
Yeah, we're not here. I do feel like we come together and we have the study so that we will gain a deeper knowledge of the Word. But at the end, the goal of that is that it ought to transform us, as opposed to like a typical class where we leave and we sort of know who ranks at the high part of it, who had the highest scores and stuff. Yeah, that's not really what we're trying to do.
And you mentioned competition once before, but rather a competition of outdoing one another and good. And
Yeah.
how often that's not, sometimes it's knowledge-based, sometimes it's holier than thou-based competition. Sometimes, I think you talked
Yes.
about this, I'm a preacher's kid, so-and-so is an elder's kid. The competition and not the good kind sneaks into our midst when we should be focused on that. What can I do for you today instead of who I am?
So that requires a great deal of self-examination to be sure we have the right motives in doing these sorts of things. It's very good. So before we come back and talk a little bit about how we take care of the physical needs, and some of those passages I've been skipping over. Let's think about this thought question for a moment. What do you think are some of the activities of this church that have been planned out, that are done on a regular basis, that would strengthen our relationships with one another?
Preaching and teaching the word of God.
Okay, so I'm too far ahead. We talked about in one place how this teaching helps to edify and build us up. But what about the idea of relationships? When we come together like this and we talk about, does that really build our relationships, this teaching and so forth?
Not directly. I mean, I guess you could make an argument that it might, but
Yeah.
I don't know that that's the way to do it.
It's not as direct. I do think that it has that as a side result, or ought to, if we're listening to what God has to say to us and allowing it to transform us, it ought to be directed. But what are some other activities? There are some other things that we do besides just the
Back
teaching.
on that though, it sets expectations.
Yes.
I think that's important to help. When you said earlier in the questions, is this a sign of the elders doing the right thing or not? It needs to be a sign of it, because you should be teaching and having expectations for how we behave. So it's like a parent, your child doesn't just get manners because they osmosis. I mean,
Right.
you have to actually enforce it and teach it and expect it, so.
And at least teach these kinds of relationships as part of that teaching. But there's some other activities, Jesse.
Every Wednesday night, there's
Right.
a bulletin.
Bulletin.
Help us.
Why, how does that help you in your relationships?
Helps me to know who's sick and
Okay.
whose family is dealing with things. And, what the upcoming lessons are about in terms of who you might invite to come with you.
Yeah, so you're pulling several different ways in which that's a valuable tool, but especially to get to know what's going on. If we're going to rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, sometimes that's a source of it. The bulletin is. What else?
Group meetings.
I say group meetings.
Yeah, group meetings. They're intended, so at least one of the two groups that are meeting are focused on members and supposed to talk about the members' needs and what's going on. So you have insight to somebody who needs help in some way. That connects back to some of those relationships. Steve, did you have your hand up?
I was gonna say, it's a growth process, so if we are increasing our personal growth, so that we learn better brotherly love and be better teachers and learn more about each other, so
Yeah.
that our relationships go stronger, then it will increase, strengthen our relationships with each other. Too many times, you might know people, but you don't really, you ask them, hey, how's things going? The easy answer is, oh, everything's fine. But if you know them, you might say, no, really.
That second question actually gets the
Exactly.
first question answered, right? Because it is not answered that way. Michael, you going to say something about
Yeah, I think like devotions usually
Yep.
also have this time where you share a meal together, you share time together. We have times where we all go to someone's house. We each have a culture at our church of having people invite other people over all the time, and just those might not be a full church-wide function, but we've created that culture where that happens and that allows
Right.
relationships.
And we encourage some of that to happen and wanting that to happen, Katie.
I think the directory is.
Yes?
Like, hey, how do I get
Yes.
in touch with this person who just recently lost their mother?
So you got all this information on an online basis. By the way, the directory, if you go in, you have access to that. You can also figure out where people live, who lives around them. So you can start to think about, okay, who's close by to me? Maybe that would be something I could think of that might help me in some way.
Well, I was thinking about, at least once a year, when we go to Paula place, when the preacher comes for the group meeting.
Right.
I mean, when the preacher comes for the meeting, that's a good way to.
Yeah, and I would say, I would distinguish again, that's not an activity we plan out as the church here. But think about this. This teaching and all of these practices have encouraged folks to be, one of those passages was the hospitality that ought to be a common thing among us. And some here have done, I think, some extraordinarily hospitable things, like the Hobotters, who have everybody over, as many as can possibly come. That's a valuable and helpful thing to us. That's an outgrowth of people actually following and doing that, even though that's their own personal decision to do it. It's a wonderful part of that activity. I think our congregational meetings, we spend time on things that would help to connect us in different ways. The announcements, You know, the announcements, you ever gone somewhere, you just kind of phase out. When it's not my home church, a lot of times announcements, I'm phasing out, right? Because I don't know those people enough. But here's sometimes when we need to be paying attention, or the screen before when you come in that provides updated information that's more detailed. All those are things intended to strengthen and build up our relationships with each other. One of the reasons why we have services on Sunday nights, we understand, this is a decision the elders have thought through. We understand there is no scriptural requirement to come twice on a Sunday. None. Okay? We don't do it because we feel like God says you got to do it, or even because it's a tradition. If we're going to be a real church of Christ, we have to do this. None of that. We do it in part because we're convinced for people of this number to get together, to know each other and build these relationships, you have to physically be together. And here's a time when we want people to be together. And that's why there are group meetings after it on Sunday night. There are devotions. There are a number of other things that have to be done. All right. So it is really important for us to take care of the physical needs of each other. Even if the teacher only leaves 5 minutes to talk about it, probably this are more like 15 or 20 minutes. I think I want you to pass it. I'll just put all these up. I'm just astonished when you go through the book of Acts at the willingness, the degree of sacrifice that they would make to take care of each other. And I think what I've thought about is that the more extraordinary the needs are, the more extraordinary the response would be. Now, there's probably a reason in Acts chapter 2 why they had such a great need. I suspect it is related to the fact that there were converts from all over the Mediterranean to Jerusalem for the Pentecost celebration or feast, as they often would do. And now they're Christians, and they don't go back home for a good period of time. And that created quite a need that they addressed by selling, as chapter 4, verse 34 talks about. Owners of houses and lands sold them, brought the proceeds of what was sold, laid at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. So again, you had that sort of any, all. Everybody got taken care of in that. And there were widows there who needed physical help, and there was a daily distribution even made to be sure that they were taken care of. And you know, we talked about that chapter, some things they had to do to be sure that every widow was taken care of, not just one. The passage in Acts 11 is interesting because here is when a need in a certain area, a group of churches in Judea had a need, and churches in other places found out about those Christians who had that need, and they made a decision that they were going to help them. And so, in this case, we're talking about the church in Antioch making a decision. The disciples determined everyone according to his ability to send relief to the brothers living in Judea, so sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. And then there's the other time when needs were sent down to Jerusalem. And there are just several places in the New Testament where it keeps touching on the same thing that's going to happen. Paul's getting ready to make the trip in Acts chapter 19 and then 20. And at the beginning part of 20, he's actually coming down to Corinth, and a bunch of people have come from different churches, and each one had made their own determination who they were going to send with Paul to take the proceeds they had gathered together. And so he writes about it in 1 Corinthians 16, he writes about it in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, and it's all the same occasion that's talked about there in this trip to Jerusalem, intended to help the needy saints. Two things I'd like you to pull out of that, even in the brief, quick flying through this. One is, who did they help in every single one of these occasions? This is Christians. And I don't think you can escape that fact. And I think that this is part of kind of understanding, we talk about the purpose of the church. What did God intend? The inward purpose of the church is that God's people will work to take care of each other. Their primary purpose in that, if you looked at Ephesians 4 the way we did, and so many other places, is that we work together to help each of us become the new man in Christ. But the reality, Emily, working together and doing that, we're going to have physical needs. And it makes no sense for us to talk about how we're going to work together if one of us is suffering physically and the rest are like, well, it's not my problem. You see, you got the passage in 1 John chapter 3, verse 16. It talks about if any brother sees someone else in need and they have goods, they can do something with it and they don't do it. Well, they don't have love. This is a fundamental part of us working together. But the ability of the church to go out and provide for those physical needs for the rest of the world is just not the purpose that's ever described anywhere you can find in the New Testament. And frankly, it's just not something it's capable of doing. I think it's something we ought to be concerned about and want to see happen, but it's not the church's responsibility to go and do that. But there's another thing that's true through here that you may not pick up as quickly as the fact that they were taking care of their own. And that is the independence of each church to make its own decision about how they were going to do it. You see, even here, I know I'm going over a little bit, even where there were different churches that sent down to the same need, they did the same kind of thing that what happened in 1 Corinthians 16. Paul says there, you decide who you want to take this gift down. In other words, it wasn't like there was one foundation or group that was going to pool all the church's monies together and then go figure out how that organization would take care of the need. Each church did its own thing and made its own decision about the men that would be part of taking care of that. I know I rushed through this. I'm so sorry. If you have some questions, I'd like to know a little bit more about how that was done and what that means, I'd be glad to talk to you later. But if we don't go soon, we'll be the ones straggling in and disturbing. So, thank you for being here. My pleasure. Hey, Patrice, have you ever gotten an over? Do you know? It's got all the material.
Hey, Chester.
Hey, how you doing?
This was
I'm
lesson
all right.
9.
How you
Yeah, I will
doing?
say, I feel like
Great.
the intention
You ready?
has been since we
Oh, let's-
came-
let's roll.
I had to lay a foundation first.
You put- David.